Sorry, I was just muted there. Thank you so much for everyone who's joining us. We've just started our first session of Evidence for Action, Aligning the Climate and SDG Agendas. While people are coming into the virtual room, I will just go through a few housekeeping rules. So if possible, if you could stay muted at all times, and also when it comes to answering questions, we'll be taking those from the chat box. So if throughout the presentations you have a question for one of our presenters today, we'll put them in there and the chair will go through them. So if we're ready to begin, I'll pass over to our chair and also the director of the Sussex Sustainability Research Programme, Professor Joseph Alcamo.
Thank you very much, Amy. Welcome to everyone. I'm Joseph Alcamo, the chair of this particular session, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the symposium on evidence for action, aligning the climate and SDG agendas. This symposium is brought to you by the University of Sussex, the Sussex Sustainability Research Programme, and 12 very good co-hosts from around the world, ranging from geographically from Mexico to Bangladesh. Greetings to you wherever you are, and we're expecting participants from virtually around the world over the next 3 days. And well, that is myself and the coordinating team are here on the south coast of England. And today the seas are calm and the tide is about to turn, and hopefully in a good direction for us. We have a very exciting program for you coming up over the next 3 very full days, including 17 excellent keynote speakers, 18 parallel sessions filled with excellent speakers also from around the world, and great opportunity to discuss really critical issues around climate goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, without any further delay, I'd like to introduce to you, to say a few welcoming words, the University of Sussex's Pro-VC, you could say the Vice President for Research, Professor Keith Jones. Keith, the floor is yours.
Oh, well, thank you, Joe, and good morning, everybody. I really warmly welcome all of you on behalf of the organisers and especially the University of Sussex. It's a great honour just to say a few words of welcome to you all. The Sustainable Development Goals and climate emergencies are probably 2 of the most important research and educational agendas we have at the University of Sussex, and I'm sure whatever institution you're at in the world, you probably feel likewise. And I think the importance of that is probably reflected by Joe a few moments ago before we started, said that we've got something like 360 participants in the course of the few days that the program is live, and I think that just really reflects the interest here. We as a university at the University of Sussex have recently launched our Sustainable Sussex strategy, and we're really proud of that. The Sussex Sustainability Research Programme that Joe directs is integral to that, and it has 4 particular aims that encompass both the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate emergency. We're planning to be ethical educators. So for us, that really means embedding in our curricula in all aspects of student learning and experience sustainability. We want to decarbonise ourselves as a university to reach net zero we've got the aim of doing it by 2035. And we're developing an action plan for that. We want to be civic leaders and partners. So we want to really partner with our community through sustainable supply chains, social responsibility and low transport emissions. So we've got aspirations there, and we also want to be environmental champions. So to promote such things as biodiversity, sustainable food, waste and water consumption and recycling at the university. So we've got a very ambitious agenda there on sustainability, and I'm sure for your own institutions, you probably have similar aspirations and strategic plans. So a warm welcome on behalf of the University of Sussex. I'm delighted that you're able to attend the symposium, and I'm really indebted to the organisers who've done such a great job in getting a thrilling agenda and symposium speakers. I hope you find it a very worthwhile experience, and I'm going to hand back to Joe, who's going to lead on the introductory symposium. So over to you, Joe, and good morning, everyone.
Thanks very much, Keith. Appreciate those words. Now I'd like to say a few words in introduction about the theme of the symposium. Get some slides loaded. So are we good to go with the slides? I don't hear any objections. Yeah, okay, good. So I guess you can all see my slides. First of all, let me say that the basic question is why? Why should we align the climate and SDG agendas? And first, I should say at the outset that we all know that climate, that is climate action, is in fact part of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's SDG 13. But the reality is that there are two or more agendas to the table. There's the climate agenda. There is an important international agreement devoted to climate goals, the Paris Climate Agreement. There's a particular UN institution, the UN Climate Secretariat, which is quite large as far as secretariats go, that's devoted to implementing climate goals or assisting countries to implement climate goals. There are 27 governments that have climate ministers. There is an entire area of science, climate journals. There's curricula in universities devoted to climate change and studies around climate change. And perhaps that's the way it should be. On the other hand, there's also an SDG agenda. The SDG agenda has its own international agreement, which is called an agenda, the 2030 Development Agenda. And it has its own UN coordinating organization. There are different ministers, apart from the climate ministers, that are responsible for the political processes around the SDGs. There are foreign affairs ministers, development ministers in some countries. There's an entire area of science and scholarly community devoted to development issues and curricula at universities. So in fact, there is in reality two agendas. Why should we bring these agendas together? Well, one very practical aspect is that they're very expensive. We globally now are investing over $500 billion per year for various kinds of climate mitigation and climate adaptation measures. That's a good thing because it begins to approach the amount that we are subsidizing fossil fuels, for example. And up to 2030, some say that we need an additional more than $800 billion per year just to implement the renewable energy aspects of climate action. And the SDGs, there's various estimates for how much they will truly cost in the end. One authoritative estimate from the UN that's used often is that additional investments in the order of 2.5–3 trillion per year are needed up to 2030 to realize the SDGs. Now, on top of all of this, the resources for these expenses, of course, have taken a hit during the pandemic. The collective cost of the pandemic, by one estimate, in 2020 alone amounted to around 12 trillion US dollars when you add up all of the extra costs that the countries put into coping with the pandemic. Now, rather than making progress during the pandemic on the various key sustainable development goals like eliminating extreme poverty and reducing the number of undernourished people in the world, we've gone in the opposite direction, unfortunately. As of the end of 2020, there are estimated to be 40 million more people in extreme poverty around the world, and the number of undernourished people has increased, not decreased, and gotten closer to the SDG 2 targets, but has increased by 130 million. So what it comes down to is that there is more to do, but fewer resources. Now, what are we going to do about it? A lot has to be done about it, but one part of the solution might be to pursue policies and measures that jointly advance climate goals and SDGs. And the good news is that there's lots of these policies and measures, and we'll be discussing many of them over the course of the next 3 days. Perhaps at the top of the list is the implementation of renewable energy. And you all know that fossil fuels are the major contributors to global warming. And in fact, the data say that about 3/4 of all global emissions have to do with the burning, or related in some way to the burning of fossil fuels. So of course, replacing fossil fuels with renewable energies, that's low carbon or no carbon renewable energies, is at the core of practically every country's and every community's plan to cope with climate change. Now, the good news is that most renewable energies have advantages over fossil fuels in many other substantial ways. So, for example, by replacing fossil fuels with most renewable energies anyway, you can drastically reduce the amount of air pollution and help achieve the health goal, SDG 3. Also, the implementation of renewable energy around the world will help achieve the energy access goal, SDG 7. So renewable energies not only achieving climate goals, but other SDGs. A second example has to do not necessarily with changing fuels we use, but how we use energy. In this particular case, cooking. So it turns out there's about 3 billion people in the world still reliant on simple but very smoky cook stoves in their households. The smoke comes from the inefficiency of the stoves, but also from the kinds of fuels that are used on these stoves. Now, it turns out, unfortunately, that these smoky stoves are a major contributor to around 4 million deaths each year caused by indoor air pollution. There are other causes, but this is the principal cause of these deaths, along with countless other illnesses, respiratory and cardiac illnesses associated with this exposure continuously to this smoke. And of course, the victims in this case are mostly women and children. Replacing these smoky stoves with clean and energy efficient ones could drastically reduce this public health threat and help us advance SDG 3. Would help to reduce the pressure that we're putting on harvesting wood in the surrounding villages where these stoves are used, and help us achieve SDG 15. It would drastically reduce the amount of black carbon emissions, which make a major contribution to climate change and therefore help us achieve climate goals. So one set of policies and measures helping us achieve both climate goals and various SDGs. The last example I'll quickly mention is much closer to home, and that is reducing food waste and loss, both in the post-harvest part of the food chain as well as in the household chain. In the global south, this food loss has mostly to do with the lack of adequate transportation of crops to bring to for transporting crops to the market, or the storage of crops until they can be brought to the market. But in the global north, as you know, it has to do with the bad habits of retail markets as well as all of us at home. Now, reducing the losses, these food losses, already in several studies have now produced convincing evidence that it would lead to a substantial decrease in the amount of cropland we need in the future. And this will have many positive knock-on effects. Less cropland means lower greenhouse gas emissions from those from that agricultural activity that's going on now. And one estimate is actually, if we are able to reduce by half the global losses of food currently in the food chain, we could save 4.5 gigatons of greenhouse gases. Now, that's a big number. In fact, that's equivalent to all of the emissions from the European Union. Less cropland also means less pressure on tropical forests, therefore less deforestation, and helps us advance SDG 15. It means less demand for water, for irrigation, one of the principal users of water in the entire world, and therefore helps us achieve SDG 6, the water goal. So one set of policies and measures, reducing food losses, contributing to achieving both climate goals and other SDGs. And now the list is quite long of these kinds of policies. And they're listed down right below those below renewable energy and clean cook stoves. There's agroforestry, there's fertilizer management, there's dietary changes, green transport, and many others. And these and others will be discussed over the coming days. Now, achieving these policies is not going to be easy. It's never easy. It's going to require a lot of cooperation in government that's not going on right now. It's going to require departments in government to work across departments rather than in silos, which they're used to. But this policy coherence is essential in achieving these policies to advance both climate goals and SDGs at the same time. Now, another important point is that an aligned climate and SDG agenda is not necessarily a just agenda. And coordinated policies are not necessarily equitable policies. And we know, I think everyone listening to this symposium and over the coming days, we'll be talking a lot about the unfortunate reality that even good, well-intentioned climate policies often, unfortunately, lead to unjust and inequitable outcomes. In Latin America and Asia, even in the United Kingdom, all around the world. In Central America, hydroelectric projects have been built in order to offset carbon. At the same time, they have violated the rights of indigenous people. In Asia, for example, in Bangladesh, there's been several international projects to restore the mangroves along the coastal region in order to protect the coastline and the people in the coastline away from coastal floods. But in the course of some of these projects, it's been documented that land has been seized from poor people or from poor fisher. So we need technically effective policies, but that's not enough. They also have to be effective, just, and equitable. And they cannot leave anyone behind. Now, those are all slogans and nice intentions, and we need to get to the facts and evidence. And that's what, in fact, this symposium's all about. We're going to be asking, how can we, in fact, align the climate and SDG agendas, recognizing all the difficulties? How can we ensure that the policies that advance both climate and the SDG agendas are just and equitable? And what is the evidence to take action that we can pass on to policymakers and communities? Now, to deal with these questions, we're going to have three streams of discussion today. The first stream has to do with this very important connection between climate adaptation, policies and measures, and various other sustainable development goals. The second stream, we'll be talking about not just climate justice and not just environmental justice, but in fact the connection between the two and both of them together. And finally, in the last stream, we'll be asking the question, what policies that advance both climate and the SDG agendas can be built in to green recovery schemes over the coming months and years? So I think that's enough of an intro, and it's about time that we get into some of the substance of our symposium here. And in the way of introduction of the next two speakers, I should mention that I already pointed out that renewable energy will be one of the key approaches that will advance both climate goals and sustainable development goals in the future. Now, conversely, the current fossil fuel economy guarantees pretty much that we won't achieve either of these, either climate goals or the sustainable development goals. So one of the great tasks we are confronted with right now is how to make the transition from fossil fuels to clean, renewable energy as quickly as possible, but also in an equitable as well as a just way. And to discuss this very important topic, we're happy to welcome two very excellent speakers. I'll introduce the first of the two speakers. That's Professor Peter Newell, who is a professor of international relations at the University of Sussex, and also the research director in an interesting new organization called the Rapid Transition Alliance. So, Pete, if you're out there, I'd like to give you the virtual floor.
Great, thanks very much, Joe. So yeah, thanks very much for the introduction and of course the invitation to speak today. So as Joe mentioned, I'm speaking really as a member of SSRP, as an academic from Sussex, from the Department of International Relations in the School of Global Studies, but also, as he mentioned, research director and co-founder of the Rapid Transition Alliance, which is one of the proud sponsors of the symposium. And so for those of you that may not have heard of the Alliance, it was founded around 3 years ago now, but has over 100 civil society organisations as members all around the world. And basically what we try to do through research, advocacy and communication work is generate what we call evidence-based hope about the possibility of change, with reference to examples all around the world today and in the past across all sectors that cover many, many of the SDGs that we'll be talking about over the next couple of days. Next slide, please, Amy. And it's change I want to talk about today, especially the need to move beyond narrower and perhaps more incremental forms of transition, which are captured in this graphic on the left of the slide that you can see there. This is the multi-level perspective that's very popular in transition studies. Which I associate with what I'm going to call plug and play approaches, where some of the bigger issues and infrastructures are not challenged, but you plug in a different set of technologies or energy sources, for example. And I juxtapose that, I contrast it with more transformational approaches that try to get to the root of the problem in political and economic systems, as you'll see in the next slide, please, Amy. And so in doing this, I'll try and draw on some of the ideas from my book Power Shift that you'll have seen on that first slide, but relate them very much to the themes of the conference. And the first issue I want to raise is around power as opposed to just looking at governance. So I'll make the links back to the book and the things that I see going on in the energy sector, but I think they relate to a lot of the issues we'll be discussing across the economy as a whole. And so that first one really is, let's talk about much more about power rather than just governance. And this is really the importance of not reducing the relationship between climate and the SDGs that we're talking about just to a narrower governance challenge of alignment, coordination, integration. Clearly, it's also about those things in the ways that Joe's already described. But I would say it's really about a shift in power, which of course is much harder to achieve, but likely a prerequisite to addressing the causes of unsustainable development in a more socially just way. So in this book, Power Shift, I make this argument that it's really power that needs to shift if we're to successfully address this issue. In other words, it's not for the lack of good technologies or pricing mechanisms that we're facing climate chaos. It's the concentration of power in actors and institutions that benefit from unsustainability and over whom we have limited control. So this includes power over production, power over finance, technology and institutions, but it's also power between nations, among social groups, the power of capital over labour, and the state over citizens. And we need disruptions and shifts and change in those things, I think, if we could seriously arrive at delivering on the SDGs. So I think without shifts in those things, you may get shifts in technology. The markets might indeed look different, but the roots of the current crisis in an unsustainably organised global political economy will remain untouched. So you could get accelerated decarbonisation through some of the means that Joe's talked about, but you wouldn't probably get it with social justice or deeper forms of sustainability. So my second point is about rebalancing economy and ecology. Precisely because of these uneven power relations, my fear is that as sustainability practitioners, we feel obliged to integrate our concerns with agendas around trade, investment and finance. But I see less evidence of things the other way around, of powerful actors reflecting on the need to change what they do in order to address the SDGs. And so I see this in the world of energy, but I see it more broadly about this imbalance, if you like, in terms of the pressure to change. So one key issue, of course, is the narrow pursuit of economic growth over all other objectives. So if goal 8 of the SDGs on growth is to be pursued to its full potential without fundamental reorientation, it will be virtually impossible to meet all the other goals around climate or biodiversity protection, for example. So unless we get to the root of unsustainability in the basic organisation of the economy, and by that I mean rethinking quite profoundly production, consumption, work, income, these basic things, I fear that it will be very, very hard indeed to achieve the SDGs. And in a way, of course, we have to ask why in a world of such spectacular wealth for some people, we still need the SDGs. I think we know by now that wealth doesn't trickle down, it gets concentrated at the top. So really the emphasis has to be on redistribution of existing wealth and new approaches to creating real, genuine, sustainable wealth. That's where a lot of the emphasis has to move to. Next slide, please, Amy. And so in relation to the book around production, for example, I argue very much, and Joyeeta may back up on this, we need to rethink how much energy we produce and for what. And we do need to lay down some limits on the supply of fossil fuels for all the reasons that Joe's alluded to. And luckily, there are big movements around this now. Many national governments from New Zealand, Costa Rica, France, Denmark have made commitments to leave supplies of fossil fuels in the ground. And there's growing momentum about ways to try and multilateralize that process. And I see this as moving in the right direction. So clearly, it's about using less energy, using energy differently, shorter circuits of energy production and consumption, more local control over the supply and distribution of energy. These are the types of power shifts that I see as fundamental to this, alongside, of course, radical reductions in demand, shifts in lifestyles, and really trying to sever our dependencies on fossil fuel incumbents. Because, of course, many of those actors are arguing that the products they produce are fundamental to modern living and people are absolutely dependent upon them. So we need to start severing those commitments one by one. And of course, that has a knock-on benefit in shifting broader geopolitics. So my third point is about lack of money not being the main problem. There are quite dominant narratives, and Joe referred to a couple of them here already, that we're not making enough progress on the SDGs because there's a lack of money and a lack of investment. What I would argue is it's the gross misallocation of money that we see, for example, in fossil fuel subsidies, the $10 million a minute, according to the IMF, that still gets spent globally on fossil fuel subsidies. So it's moving us in exactly the wrong direction at the time of a climate emergency. So there's no way we'll deliver on SDG 13 unless we deal with that one. But likewise, thinking more broadly, you could talk about military spending, which rose to almost $2 trillion in 2020. And of course, that's fueling and undermining our ability to address SDG 16 on peace and security. So it's clearly about reducing some forms of expenditure and then redirecting it elsewhere. If poverty targets addressed by SDG 1 are to be met, we clearly need redistribution through things like better taxation, upper limits on income, I would argue, debt relief, universal basic income schemes, these sorts of things. Next slide, please, Amy. So thinking about finance again, bringing this back to energy, my own particular area of interest, we do need a different model of financing energy with a greater role for patient capital, different ownership structures, much stronger governance of finance for the common good at all levels of governance, as well as addressing some of the blind spots around private finance in particular, which really needs much stronger steering towards the achievement of the SDGs. And that, of course, alongside huge divestment from particular industries, projects and infrastructures that are based on fossil fuels. But the key thing in all of this is that finance isn't an end in itself, and yet it often gets talked about as if it is. We need to much more squarely think about what's the ultimate objective of this. And so just to give you one concrete example, when I was at the Paris Climate Summit, there was huge talk about a clean energy revolution for Africa. And it was all about mobilizing, de-risking capital without any discussion of whose energy needs would actually be met by this and on what terms, given the number of people that are still off grid, that can't afford connection charges, all of these sorts of things. It was just this, pour lots of private capital into Africa and somehow that will lift people out of energy poverty without a serious conversation about needs and means and all of these sorts of things. So money in and of itself is not the answer, is what I'm saying there. Fourth key point is about placing justice centrally. Again, Joe's touched on this already. And the key thing really here for me is not passing on the costs of action onto poorer groups within and between societies. And there is a danger of this happening around the drive towards biofuels or even electrification, which leads to pressures on land and on minerals elsewhere. Unless we really think about reducing demand or shifting basic provision of key services, we'll just get more of this, what I refer to as a plug and play approach. All other things stay the same and you just plug in a different set of technologies and energy sources, but it will lead to exactly the same problems. In other words, it's quite hard to have clean energy in a dirty economy. So we talk about these things as trade-offs, but really it's actually about displacement of spatial and temporal fixes that are often being used to move problems elsewhere through offsetting, through carbon trading, And instead, I think we need to be holding our own governments to account to reduce emissions at source as far as possible. And there's real dangers, as I'm sure we'll be discussing in the conference, around some of the net zero proposals that are out there, which basically imply enclosing other people's resources elsewhere. So you get Shell, for example, the oil company, saying that they can carry on extracting oil for some time into the future on the basis that they're going to offset those emissions by buying up huge swathes of lands, the equivalent globally to a land area the size of Brazil. This is how they're going to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is all about offsets and carbon trading, is up for discussion. So we really need to place clear limits and have stronger governance mechanisms in place. So my hope in this conference is that we can move beyond just sort of spotting synergies, trade-offs, mapping links, all of which is really important, to thinking a bit more about when these things conflict, why do certain actors' interest priorities always take priority, and what can we do about that? So at the very least, I think, the pursuit of the SDGs should do no harm, but I think they also need to start from this need to sort of build justice in from the very start. And that requires a socially differentiated approach. It's not about we're all in this together. It very much has to be about rolling back the influence of more powerful actors. So there is a big governance challenge there. It is about things like their donations to political parties, revolving doors, access to key committees, all of these sorts of things, all these manifestations, if you like, of incumbent power need to be reined in and controlled if we're going to get anywhere near these ambitious goals, because otherwise they have this power of veto, they have the power to hold progress. So it is tackling what I've referred to in other work as the polluter release. But for most people, it's really just about enabling the right infrastructures to access clean water and clean energy and better housing and all of these sorts of things. So we do need this socially differentiated approach. And then just finally, and this is the last slide, please, Amy, it's about governance, but it's about shifting power from above in the ways of describing, but also supporting it from below. We need much more democratization of decision-making around these things, greater participation in deliberations around food and energy futures, for example, principles of subsidiarity, building on the experiments around citizens' assemblies, for example, trying to build ownership and build people's voices into these processes about how we deal with some of these trade-offs and try and resolve them in more socially just ways. And of course, that means checks and balances and stronger accountability mechanisms. So my final plea for us today and tomorrow in the workshop is, let's talk about governance, but let's also please talk about power and politics, because I think it's central to our discussions. And so, Amy, if you could just show the last two slides, I'll stop there, but they give more information about the Rapid Transition Alliance. So if you want to know more, go onto the website and better still, join us. Thank you very much.
Pete, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. Thanks for reminding us about things that maybe we don't think enough about. That is the importance of power relations, the basic aspects of the economy like production and consumption, as you mentioned, and the importance of resource distribution in achieving our climate goals and the SDGs. Thank you very much. So next, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Joyeeta Gupta, who is a professor of environment and development at the University of Amsterdam and also a professor at the Delft Institute for Water Education, as well as being the co-chair of the Earth Commission, aiming to come up with equitable and just targets for the world. Joyeeta, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much. So I'll follow in the footsteps of Joseph and Peter by focusing on the power aspects and especially on the financial aspects. And my question is, who pays for leaving fossil fuels underground? So if you want to promote renewables without equitably addressing who leaves fossil fuels underground, I think we will fail. So in other words, any transition towards renewables without actually facing the issue of fossil fuels is going to fail. Now, For a background, I have 3 or 4 points. The first is that for a 1.5 degree centigrade future, we probably need to reduce our CO2 emissions by net 45% in 2030 with respect to 2010 levels, and we need to get to net zero in 2050. The later we start, the sharper the reductions have to be, as shown in the figure on top, which is a classic figure from Figueres et al. Of 2017. Net zero, as Peter has also pointed out, is problematic because many companies and many people and many countries think that they can continue to use fossil fuels if only they did a little bit of bioenergy or carbon capture and storage. But these are risky, underdeveloped, expensive options, and they require more land and water than is actually available. So from my perspective, part of the story of addressing climate change as well as trying to achieve the other SDGs must imply a focus on fossil fuels. Now, if we need to focus on fossil fuels, we need to recognize that fossil fuels are destined to become stranded. For a 2 degree centigrade world, 80% of coal, 50% of gas, and 33% of oil must be left underground. And this basically means that a gigantic chunk of the available fossil fuels has to be left below the ground. This brings me to the burning question. Who can use the remaining fossil fuels? Who can't? Who pays? And why did the Paris Agreement not even mention the word fossil fuels? Let me start with the last one first. I think that the Paris Agreement did not mention fossil fuels or leaving fossil fuels underground because if we were to announce a fossil fuel phase out in a legally binding agreement, the price of fossil fuel would collapse and those who owned it could not sell it. So most fossil fuel asset owners would have put pressure behind closed doors on the Paris Agreement negotiations to ensure that it did not mention the word fossil fuels. And in the meanwhile, smart fossil fuel companies and investors are trying to sell their fossil fuel assets behind closed doors. However, if buyers realize the risk of fossil fuel purchases and have alternatives, they may not buy. And one day, the entire fossil fuel market could collapse. But why is this important? And this brings me to the worth of the fossil fuel economy. Now, the literature tells us that fossil fuels are worth between 12 to 300 trillion US dollars. Now, this range depends on the time period that you take into account for calculating the fossil fuel economy. It takes into account whether you include reserves and or resources, and whether you also look at the different uses of fossil fuels. So when we're talking about the ship industry or the aircraft industry, the car industry, etc. Or even, for example, if you're cooking on a gas stove, that's also a different type of use of fossil fuels. Now, this amount, this 12 to 300 trillion US dollars, is significant when you realize that in 2019, the global GDP was only $86 trillion. And this basically means that fossil fuel asset holders are most likely holding the global economy at ransom. Now, who are these rich actors and asset owners? Well, first, you have the fossil fuel firms, and their global worth is as much as $300 trillion, but many have valuations much higher than most countries. Most of these large firms are in the United States, European Union, and Canada. Increasingly, we see them also in the global south, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, China, and India. Who has shares in these fossil fuel firms? Well, they're mostly pension funds and philanthropies. Now, 51% of the global 2019 GDP was in pension funds. And 98% of these pension fund assets are in the global north, in the OECD area. But between $270 to $980 billion of these pension funds were invested in liquid fossil fuel assets in 2019. And the range is so high simply because when you look at pension fund documentation, their annual reports, they don't always report about their fossil fuels. And what is more important is when you speak to pension funds, they tell you that they are under a fiduciary responsibility to try to make sure that their pensioners get their pensions. And so they don't really have a very strong responsibility with respect to phasing out fossil fuels. Let's talk about another actor, philanthropies. Philanthropies are growing rapidly. They have hundreds of billions of dollars in total assets. Most of these foundations are in the United States, UK, and the European Union. And many of them have ties to the fossil fuel sector. We've been trying to look at all these philanthropies' annual reports to understand how much money they have in the fossil fuel sector. And most of them don't actually declare this information. You really have to do a lot of detective work to understand what they do. Now, most of us understand that philanthropies are very kind because the amount of money they spend on their good deeds is the one that they talk about. But these good deeds are actually financed by the profits made from their much larger corpus of money, which is invested. And that investment is often in fossil fuels. And nobody's talking about that part of the activities of the philanthropies. And then, of course, you have the banks, the European Union banks, the US banks, the Asian banks, who have lent $2.7 trillion between 2015 to 2020 on fossil fuels. So I'm not talking about the subsidies that Joseph and Peter were talking about. I'm simply talking about relatively new investments. And export credit, when export credit is the money given by governments to their own companies to enable them to invest in developing countries. Now, export credit of more than $30 billion was spent on fossil fuels. And these were initially mostly located in the US and in the European Union and Japan, but increasingly also China and India are using export credit to finance fossil fuels in other parts of the world. Now, let's look at it from the perspective of the investor. So if you have a lot of investment in fossil fuels, what are your options? Option number one is sell this fossil fuel investment as quickly as possible, make the profit, and transfer the looming losses to somebody else, perhaps to someone in the global south. But then you create a new vested interest and the problem is not solved. Another option for the investor is to engage with the fossil fuel company. But then what does the company do with all the fossil fuels it is sitting on, or with the fossil fuel assets it's sitting on? So that's another whole ball game that has to be addressed. And of course, what happens when the investor makes this profit by selling this fossil fuel? Well, it needs to invest it somewhere else. And there are not enough sustainable options. And this is why we're also seeing a massive trend into commodification of resources worldwide and more land and water grabbing, which will actually affect our ability to achieve many of the other SDGs, causing a new problem. Now, before I go forward, let me just explain the terms stranded resource and stranded asset. A stranded resource is a resource you cannot use. For example, a forest that cannot be deforested in order to make roads or a city, or oil resources that cannot be used. A stranded asset is slightly different. An asset is something that you've used to actually invest in that resource. And this asset could be a physical infrastructure, technology, or equipment that can no longer be used, or human skills and knowledge that can no longer be used, so you lose jobs, or legal contracts that are now broken, or financial shares, loans, and bonds for which you are afraid you will not be able to get your returns on. And it also includes indirect assets such as petrol and diesel vehicles. Now, the next question that comes to mind is who is left with these stranded resources? What we are seeing is that if you start to calculate where are most of the fossil fuel reserves, well, they're mostly in the global south. For example, 75% of global proven oil reserves in 2019 were in the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. Now, globally, in the climate change negotiation regime, we have not yet decided who can use this fossil fuel. A hypothesis is that global North governments probably want to deplete their own reserves before explicitly calling for leaving fossil fuels underground, de facto leaving the global South with huge stranded resources. In other words, resources that they cannot use. That's one part of the problem. But another part of the problem is that in the global North, we have so much knowledge and technology on these issues. We also have money for which we don't get much interest in our own countries. So what we are finding is that rich countries and financial actors, including in the emerging economies, are spending massively on fossil fuel investments, loans, and aid to developing countries, running into the trillions. If you compare that with the amount they're willing to spend in the developing countries on mitigation and adaptation, that's more in the millions and perhaps a few billions. And within this, it's not just the private sector. Public spending between 2006 and 2019 was at $106 billion, of which $42 billion was spent after the Paris Agreement was ratified. So they are basically helping developing countries now to invest in their fossil fuels. And that means that this stranded resource will now become a much more expensive stranded asset in the future. In this particular graph, what we're trying to show you is what were the flows on the left side between 2007 and 2015, and the flows between 2016 and 2020. The top row shows bilateral flows, the middle row multilateral, the bottom row shows you export credit. And we're looking at the flows from the north to Africa. So we didn't look at all of the South, just to Africa. And what you're seeing is that the bilateral flows are quite heavy from northern countries, but also increasingly from China to Africa. If you look at multilateral flows, then they're much more heavier from the United States and the European Union to Africa. Although these multilateral flows are now going down under pressure. If you look at export credit, this continues. Export credit, especially from Europe, is going up quite high. One reason why the export credit from the United States looks quite thin is because under the Trump era, there was nobody in charge of the department, and so their projects slowed down. But also what we see is that China is becoming a new source of export credit to their own companies to invest in the fossil fuel market in Africa. If you look at the private sector investment, so the previous chart was on public, now private, then we are looking at major shareholders in African fossil fuel investments. And most of these shareholders are in the United States, Canada, Russia, China, Japan, Europe, Australia, and also South America and Brazil. So a lot of the assets are being held in the hands of foreign investors. And so the question is, who would be left with the stranded asset if these fossil fuel investments have to be phased out? Now, normally these investments are for a period of 30 to 80 years. So if you prematurely phase out, somebody is left holding a bubble that has burst. And is it going to be the foreign investor, or is it going to be the national government? And what you can see is that if you look at the legal contracts, fossil fuel investments are normally made through these contracts, and these contracts are generally made with a state actor. So if the state actor, say the government of Ghana or Mozambique or whatever, decides to prematurely phase out a fossil fuel plant in their own country, they're basically breaching a contract with the private company. When that happens, if the contract falls under international private law, which generally happens when this is a foreign investor, this implies massive costs for the government. So either they have to compensate the company for closing down the fossil fuel project, or the fear of such a court case can lead to policy freezing, which means that they don't close it down. And that means you don't solve the problem either. And this is not speculative. When Mrs. Merkel in Germany tried to close down the nuclear power plants, a number of court cases were brought under these bilateral investment treaties to charge the German government for compensation for closing down those firms. And across Europe, we're seeing when governments try to close down a fossil fuel plant, the company, if it is a foreign company, will try to sue the government for money. And this is happening in the developing world, in the area of mining especially, but it can happen and become much more strong in the future. And so we come to the sort of bigger storyline. Why did the climate change regime not assign emission rights or the rights to use your fossil fuels if they're also in your part of the world? And one could argue this is because powerful countries do not want to recognize the right to development of poorer people and countries, because powerful countries and powerful investors wish to maximize their use of fossil fuel first and did not factor in the time for a fossil fuel investment to mature in the global south, because they hope that they could force a post-equity phase where everyone does what they want, can, or wish, and still achieve 1.5 degrees, because they ignored their huge fossil fuel reserves in the global south. And this makes it a sorry story, because we know that the top 10% emits 45% of the global emissions, while the bottom 50% barely emits 13% of global emissions. And essentially, what we're trying to do is to squeeze that bottom 50% by the way in which we are organizing this fossil fuel asset portfolio at the global level. And I'm pretty sure that the bottom 50% will fight back. So while meeting the Paris Agreement requires a rapid phase out of fossil fuels and arguably pushes the burden of paying for the phase out on the global south, these country governments can retaliate by simply not phasing out the use of fossil fuels. Now, we could think in Europe that we'll put up a border tax adjustment to stop the problem, but that won't help if the south of 150 countries trades amongst each other. And will this not lead to an entire collapse of the climate agreement? So the real question is, how do we focus our attentions on the big money in the system? And this brings me to my conclusion. The climate regime did not equitably share the right to use natural resources and fossil fuels. The northern fossil fuel lobby probably had a strong role in this. Rich investors don't want to write off their investments, so they continue to invest in fossil fuels at home or abroad. And sometimes when they are shareholders, they prefer to divest and sell their shares to unsuspecting purchasers who are then left with the fossil fuel shares. And in the meanwhile, the rich investors hide behind fossil fuel users. I've heard big companies also talk about the fact that how can we stop with our fossil fuel investments when the public desperately needs the fossil fuel for their transport? Achieving 1.5 degrees centigrade at this moment in a post-equity world, as can be seen from the Paris Agreement, arguably pushes the bill of achieving this onto the global south directly, either by forcing them to strand their assets and their resources, and or indirectly if they have to pay for contract breaches or are left with fossil fuel shares. And if the global south fights back, we all lose. If the global south decides we don't care, we're going to take the fossil fuels out, and I'm now talking about the governments and the rich elite in the global south, not the poor. If they decide to use it, we all lose. So there is, for me, no option but to equitably face this problem and try to see how we are going to address this. And perhaps we can use some of the ideas that Peter put on the table, which was more tax justice. Perhaps we can look at the way of that Joseph put on the table of making renewables more cost effective and removing subsidies on fossil fuels. But in the final analysis, we really have to look at the fossil fuel sector much more strongly, look at our own pensions and our own pension funds and how they are functioning and our own role within that in order to address this larger global inequitable problem. Thank you.
Joyeeta, thank you so much. I'm a little bit flabbergasted. So many elephants in the room. I was just counting them as you were talking. Pension funds, philanthropies, debt financiers. The only ones you left out, I guess, were priests and monks. And then who's going to be caught embracing the bubble when it bursts? Another key question. Well, thank you very much for those new insights, which we're going to have to cope with. So we've been getting in some questions for our speakers, and I'm going to, the first one I'd like to address to both of you, even though Maya Bogers from Utrecht University posed this question, but I'd like to ask both of you this question, and that is, given the fact that the Paris Agreement and, well, she's asking whether the global agendas such as the climate agenda and the SDGs, the 2030 agenda, development agenda, can contribute to the power shift you have been talking about, taking into account the fact that they were developed largely by the institutions that are currently in power. So do they have a vested interest then? Can we work within the processes of the Paris Agreement? Can we work within the processes of the Sustainable Development Goals to achieve this kind of power shift? Pete, do you have an answer for that?
I can have a go. It's a big question. Look, I think, we have to see the Paris Agreement and the SDGs as a product of difficult negotiations. And there's lots of, elephants in the room. There's lots of tensions there. So ultimately, resolving them in a fair and just way is about national level and subnational level struggles to try and work out really what to do. So it offers a useful reference point. One of the things I think the SDGs are really useful for me at least, is when projects are being proposed on one ground, and it could be a fossil fuel project, going back to Joyeeta's presentation just now, you can keep saying, how is this aligned with Paris? How is this aligned with SDGs? You've not thought through all these knock-on impacts on land or on biodiversity or on water use or whatever it might be. So for me, the SDGs in their truest sense have that potential to say, we need more 360 thinking. What's the rounded, more holistic way of thinking about this? Because you have your government, our government has signed up to these. What are the ways in which, as you make decisions, you're really thinking through the knock-on impacts in terms of your ability to meet the SDGs? So for me, it allows you to ask the awkward questions and to force that more joined up thinking, or to point out blatant contradictions. And I think we are seeing this. People are referring constantly to the Paris Agreement when there's new proposals for oil licenses or even coal mines or things like that in this country even, let alone elsewhere, or to deal with some of the problems that Joyeeta was talking about, where we still use export finance. It was only very recently that the UK stopped export finance for fossil fuels, and that came on the back of a big campaign. But one of the key reference points was, you've signed up to Paris. How on earth are you going to achieve Paris if you're just displacing the problem elsewhere? You're funding coal-fired power plants in Mozambique or wherever it might be, and that's inconsistent. So I think it's a useful reference point for pointing out some of those tensions and contradictions. So in and of themselves, they don't bring about the power shifts. That's down to all of us to hold governments to account, to force these issues. But it's a useful tool and reference point to say, you've signed up to this and you need to think more holistically. It can't just be about the pursuit of one of these SDGs in isolation.
And if I can add to that, I would like to make 2 points. The first point is that when we look at Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement, this is sort of a public law, either soft or hard law agreement. Agenda 2030 is soft, the Paris Agreement is hard. But when you look at the contracts, they are super, super hard. Contracts are mostly protected by international private law and investment law, and they are you can't break them easily. If you break them, you're going to have to pay money. So in some ways, you can see that Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement are sort of the goodwill of the global community to try and talk about the sort of problems we want to solve, against that background of any money transfer being completely embedded and enmeshed in hard law contracts. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is I think Agenda 2030, like Peter was saying, is a compromise. It goes many steps ahead because for the first time in the history of our legal system, we have not only sort of environmental treaties and trade treaties, but we've also upgraded social goals into that same spectrum of your 360, to use your narrative, 360-degree storyline. So what we're trying to do with the SDGs is not only bring the binding legal goals, but also the most soft goals we're trying to bring at the same level, and we have the inequality goal. But we have taken one major step, or maybe two major steps backwards. In law, there used to be a principle called the no harm principle. And there was a very famous case between the United States and Canada, the trail smelter case, which basically said that you can't harm another country. And that has always been there in law. And somehow, Agenda 2030 and the climate agreements do not talk about not causing harm to others and having to be liable or compensate others for that harm that is caused. And I think we need to develop this if we really want to catch these big fossil fuel companies and investors in the fossil fuel arena. So the corrective justice arena is not addressed through Agenda 2030. The other issue is, and I don't know whether you're familiar with this, but Agenda 2030 has gone back towards full permanent sovereignty. And in doing so, I think the developing countries must have put this on the agenda because they were afraid they will not be allowed to use their natural resources. And so they've come back with this reincarnation of the full permanent sovereignty idea, which enables them to move away from so-called partnerships to do what they like within their own countries. And I'm sure they've also helped in this by many developed countries who also feel that there's a benefit. So there are pros and cons to this global arena.
So do either of you think that there should be a mid-course correction with regards to these big international regimes like the Paris Agreement and the SDGs? Do we need to try and get the politicians back together again so that there's this legitimacy, this international legitimacy about the final about revised solutions with regards to emissions and stranded resources for fossil fuels, about the various power relations that are not working right now within the 2030 agenda, are not expressed in the correct way. So is that the way to go, or do you expect more? There should be more of a grassroots movement that's going to influence countries one by one.
I could start with this. I mean, there is a growing grassroots movement, and we see this across the developing world as well as in the developed countries, where grassroots organizations are trying to close down individual fossil fuel firms, where they're taking these fossil fuel companies to court and hope that the court will then close it down, so thereby creating a precedent. So we see some of that. However, and we desperately need these grassroots movements. However, the bigger issue is to come back to corrective justice. And corrective justice basically would mean that somebody has to be held accountable for the massive damage that's taking place, whether it's in Germany or in the Maldives or Tuvalu or wherever in the world, the damage that's taking place, someone has to be held accountable. And to some extent, I think the fossil fuel firms have had a massive profitable run. They are the ones that could perhaps be held responsible. So in addition to your distributive tax justice storyline, a corrective justice storyline will be necessary to enable that redistribution to also take place. So it should not simply be that because I'm kind, I'm paying more taxes. It's because you created a problem and you knew about the problem. And for most people, we don't care as to where the electricity comes from. We just need to know that electricity will come or that we can use a fuel. So it's really the big companies that make the profits, I think, that need to be targeted next. And also, I think that when these contracts break, there has to be a real change in the way we look at these contracts.
Yeah,
Great.
I would echo all of that. I definitely think, and again, it's a big issue on the agenda at Glasgow is the whole lost and damage discussion, which is an important way of dealing with that issue. But to come back to the first part of the question, I think I tend to think about it in terms of an ecosystem of transformation. You need to plug all levers of change simultaneously, given where we're at.
Seems like the internet couldn't handle Pete's politically
Okay.
charged solutions. Go ahead. Repeat
can you
last
hear me now?
10, 15 seconds. Yes, we got you loud and clear now.
Okay, so yeah, I was just talking about the need for sort of ecosystems of transformation, by which I mean, targeting theories of change to particular contexts, but some of it is about targeting finance in the way Joyeeta was talking about. I mean, waves of shareholder activism, there's the litigation, there's the direct action, the protest. So I think let's not hang it all on just resolving all of this at the global level and through multilateral processes, because power clearly lies elsewhere in lots of settings. And given the remaining time we have to try and turn this around, we need to use all levers all at once as fast as we can, basically.
Right. So we have a comment in that's interesting from Marion Belsheim, who says that member states, those are the member states that agreed to the 2030 development agenda and the Paris Agreement, member states pushed many of those infamous opening clauses into the 2030 agenda, like we reaffirm that every state has and shall freely exercise full permanent sovereignty over all its wealth, natural resources, and economic activity. Yes, it's the same for climate.
Yep.
So, this is an academic conference, symposium after all. So let me get a little bit back to the academia. So both of you have raised tremendous amount of key questions, elephants in the room, knowledge that needs to get out there. So from an academic standpoint, what do you see are the big questions that the academics, the universities, the research institutes, the research arms of governments need to look at over the coming years in order to facilitate this rapid transition, in order to resolve this dilemma we have now with the stranded fossil fuels?
So Joseph, if I can come back
where
on
are the big research questions?
if I can come back on this, if you look at the bulk of the sort of questions that are asked by research institutions, when they put out calls for proposals, they don't really focus on the big investors. They're really focusing on how can we get the new technologies and get in renewables and stuff like that. How can we look for win-win solutions? How can we be more innovative? It's really difficult. I have been trying for the last 10 years to find a call where I could put my stranded asset research question into. And it's been really, really complicated. If you go to ministries and ask for resources, this is not a topic on which they want to spend money.
No.
And even if they want to talk about export credit, they don't want to spend money there. So we've been trying to do this, and now luckily I have my money for this particular project. But the main thing I think is that I think national research councils and governments are very scared of this bigger financial issue.
Could be. So you're saying we have to go back to the funding organizations and need to twist their arms such that they make available opportunities for researchers to get into these questions and really analyze them in some objective way. Pete, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think one of the key things is we're talking about incumbent actors, and they don't want to have these conversations, and they're actively trying to close them down. And of course, some of the key actors on the fossil fuel side are state-owned companies. And state-run research councils might also be reluctant to pose some of these questions or address them head on. So it is very, very difficult. But I do think we need to think about, how can we fairly leave remaining reserves of fossil fuels in the ground? I think these questions are absolutely central. What are the national and international mechanisms to do that? And there is more and more work coming online on that, because it's been hugely neglected so far. But the last few years, there is more interest in that. I think for me also, how to square the equity and the urgency part of things is absolutely vital, given the scale and nature of change that's required. But how to do that in an equitable and inclusive way, this is one of the most pressing questions that comes up all the time, because sometimes when you emphasize speed and urgency, it implies top down, and that can often be regressive. So how do you also involve citizens and make sure this is fair, and we think, and the costs in the way I was describing are not just pushed on to other other parts of the world or other poorer groups in society. And I think more broadly, in terms of, sort of research questions, it's really around those theories of change. Like what are the examples? This is what we're trying to do with the Alliance in a way. Where has change occurred? What can we learn from it? How can we share that knowledge? What's generalizable? What's not? Those sorts of things about let's ride the waves of where change is already happening rather than always sort of just projecting into the future, because that's what we need to look for too, I think.
So we often talk about the fact that we need this bottom-up participation in this transition away from fossil fuels to a low-carbon society, and in helping to implement the other SDGs. So what actually kind of institutions do we need at this grassroots level? And how then can governments, where we do pay our taxes so that the governments take care of social services, then what can governments do to support these institutions locally?
You know, the problem, of course, for local protest is that although these protests are happening worldwide, and there are a number of projects that are actually recording each protest, you're also finding a shrinking civic space. So overall, across the world, governments are getting tighter and more strict with the amount of space they provide to individuals to protest. And even in a country like India, which is very democratic, or was very democratic, and there was a lot of freedom to go to courts. Right now, the protest movements are coming under a lot of control. And so somehow we seem to have reached into a spiral. And I'm not sure, Joseph, if this is because it's not just climate change. Biodiversity, we are crossing planetary boundaries. There's not enough fresh water in the system. There's, you know, if you look at the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycle, all these different areas are all adding up to a shrinking eco space, a reduced amount of space within which we can function. And this might be bringing us the bad news that we all have to really change the way we live. In Peter's words, it's like we need the regenerative economy. We need a sharing, caring economy that he was trying to talk about. But it basically means that he's talking about us not spending our money, traveling all over the world, using less energy, eating less meat. So basically, maybe this is the bad news that's embedded in the larger story of how we are going to share this planet with 10 billion people. And governments are afraid. And I think that's why they're clamping down. I don't know if that's the case.
Now, just to add a phrase, one positive phrase, and then we'll wrap up the session.
I mean, I would come back to the evidence-based hope and encourage people to look at the website, because people are taking things into their own hands precisely because governments are often closely associated with some of these powerful actors, or feel like they don't have the resources or the power to do these things. People are doing things from below, and there are rapid transitions going on around energy and food and water all over the world, and we've done these things before. So that let's start with those positives and think about how we can move forward from there. But we do have to push back. Part of it can't just be about only finding the positives. It has to be about, we need to really rein in the power of these actors that are systematically vetoing more sustainable options. That has to be part of the picture as well.
Great.
So when I finished
go ahead, Joyeeta.
When I finished my PhD thesis, I was quite depressed. That was on climate change in 1997. And Professor Kamal Hossain was my opponent. And he said to me from Bangladesh, he said that when he was growing up in Bangladesh, he never thought that the British colonialists would leave. And one morning they were gone. And I think it's the same with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Politics happens overnight. And I have a feeling that one morning we will wake up and the fossil fuel empire will have collapsed. But we will have to work towards it.
Okay. Great. With those wise words from Joyeeta and Peter, we'll wind up this session. And with great thanks to Keith Jones, Peter Newell, and Joyeeta Gupta for great presentations and a great discussion afterwards. And I invite all of you to stick with us for the next 3 days, where we're going to be dealing with these kinds of important, critical questions and many more, and looking for a better future, folks. Thank you very much, and stick with us for the rest of the symposium. Bye now, and thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.